April the 4th, 1984. To the past or to the future, to an age when thought is free, from the age of Big Brother, from the age of the thought police, and from a dead man. Greetings. So says Winston Smith, the protagonist of George Orwell's 1984, as he draws us in. That's a copy of the book 1984 by George Orwell. In it, he talks about the potential of a totalitarian takeover after a nuclear war. In it, newspeak is introduced. There's a telescreen in the other room.
Oh, hey, I didn't see you there. You should be quiet so Big Brother and the telescreen don't hear us. You know, religious themes, particularly those Christian origin, have heavily impacted our country, especially during those times of war and strife. Christian influence is omnipresent, from the trenches to dinner tables, from the greetings to our farewells, from our churches to the government. Thomas Howell, in his Soldiers of the Pen, explains how the government knows this and puts to use societal pressures and expectations to encourage support of certain activities from which the government may benefit. Let's talk about this encouragement, shall we? Propaganda supporting the war effort in the United States certainly resembles aspects of sermons citizens might hear on Sunday mornings across the country. Altars of Ammo describes a religious plurality within the U.S. Army. Some units were formed regionally, such as the 103rd Division or Cactus Division, comprised of men from Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico. The 36th Division, Texas T, originally constituted of men from the Texas and Oklahoma National Guards. Others were not formed regionally. Regardless of the regional alignment or lack thereof, there was little thought given to the religious affiliation of the soldiers. Of course, the men were allowed to hold whatever religious beliefs they wanted, and even loosely encouraged to attend some form of religion. Imagine what happens if you don't go to church on Sunday morning. The cleaning, the dusting. Ugh. There would inevitably be a mix of religious observations within the units. Each unit would have a chaplain. There is likewise a plurality of religion within the training of chaplains by the chaplain's corps. One chaplain is assigned to take care of the spiritual needs of the entire unit. The unit consists of men from different cultural backgrounds, born or living in different regions of the country, and who possibly were born in the U.S. or even immigrated from abroad. So we see soldiers with various views on religion, and we do not see a unit have a single religious sect. We have a single chaplain in charge of the spiritual health within the unit. And the various churches would have submitted men to become chaplains for the Army. These chaplains would have singular beliefs and religious cultures. The Army, generally speaking, did not care about these differences in religious views, and most of the time, any chaplain would address the religious and spiritual needs of any soldier. Certain exceptions could be made if a chaplain could be brought in within a reasonable amount of time.
The question of America's Christian foundation causes much debate, but we will focus on observations made in Hall's piece, Did America Have a Christian Founding?, and give a sufficient answer for my purposes today. It is important to understand that early settlers in America were escaping religious governments and persecution. They settled in America for the purpose of forming something different. Many of the founding fathers did hold Christian beliefs and practices, but not all. As the founders began crafting the documents establishing the country, they tread a fine line between forming a country which would be Christian and uphold the values generally professed by Christianity, and avoiding any overt imposition of the Christian God and specific beliefs and faith references at the federal level.
There would be much change in the country's religious landscape in the decades leading up to World War II, but the foundations were strong. Christian influence and the practice of Christian religions, among others, we do have the freedom of religion here after all, was commonplace during the war years. During the 1941 State of the Union address, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt 3 times called out 4 reasons for U.S. involvement in the war. The speech happened before Pearl Harbor, at a time when the U.S. was remaining neutral, but was still providing war materials to the Allies through the Lend-Lease program. Shh.
These four pillars President Roosevelt mentioned are freedom of worship, freedom of speech, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. This speech sets the tone for religious ideas used in the war effort, so it's expected that government agencies and efforts use this speech in the underlying Christian ideals and messages to sway the populace. Norman Rockwell's illustrations for 4 wartime posters provide the visual impact to drive home the president's desires. In fact, many artists created pro-war works during the war years. Hollywood, Cloaks a film studio, owned and operated by the United States Army Air Force, as Pierce Redmond reveals. There are scores of movies, posters, cartoons, poems, and songs that are pro-war. Many of these were not created with direct government influence. However, many notable names did generate products under the Writers' War Board. Florian Gargiello, in Wistful Lies and Civil Virtues, tells of Randall Jarrell, a poet and U.S. Army Air Force officer. Another, Theodore Geisel. Dr. Seuss, also a captain in the Army. Even Walt Disney was persuaded to contribute.
Let's consider the Writers' War Board posters published and distributed during the war. Sure, the government was not directly involved, but it didn't stop them from putting their hands in the cookie jar. The National Archives Records Administration, or NARA, even utilizes a teaching guide enlisting World War II posters to educate on government propaganda. We see a number of messages in these posters.
Some serve to dehumanize or demonize the enemy. Remember, the war mostly takes place overseas, so citizens did not experience the horrors. Pop culture serves as the source for how the artists dehumanize the enemy, and of course, the Bible speaks of demons and hell in its messaging of salvation through Christ. In 1942, Emperor Hirohito is depicted with bloody hands. A casual viewing of the image might miss this, but his hands are bony and pointed with sharp nails. Although the Bible does not specifically describe the appearance of demons, the visual evolution of the devil throughout the ages chronicles artists' depictions of hell going at least back as far as the 13th century, which showed denizens of hell illustrated much like we'd imagine them today. Pair this all with the fact that he is the enemy of the United States, and this is the dehumanization of the Emperor of Japan. Jordan Kipper, in Towards an Anthology of War Propaganda, remarks that the language of myths, sacred texts, and history are reinterpreted by leaders to inculcate violent ideologies. And again, the Empire of Japan is demonized with claws and a furry, bloody hand in this war bonds poster. Note the swastika. So the Nazis are friends with the Japanese, so they're included in the demonization or dehumanization. Some are damned obvious, with direct references to hell. There's one with a horned character of a Japanese man surrounded by fire. Another commonality among these is the blatant racism portrayed in the facial features of the enemy. We do not merely destroy our enemies, we change them. George Orwell, 1984. Consider Luke 8:12, NIV. Those along the path are the ones who hear, and then the devil comes and takes away the word from their hearts, so that they may not believe and be saved. When you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. Ha! Car share advertisements were used to convince civilians to reduce fuel. A memorable poster depicts Hitler as an apparition sitting in your passenger seat. Think of him as the devil on your shoulder convincing you to sin. Think of the verse, "For where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there I am in the midst of them." Matthew 18, 19, and 20. Clearly, if this gentleman had joined a carpool, the devil wouldn't have been able to tag along. Many pieces of propaganda portrayed any behavior not aligned with furthering the war efforts as sinful. One of the 7 deadly sins, sloth, is seen frequently. Go ahead and be lazy. Hitler wants you to do nothing today. After all, Proverbs 16:27 says, "Idle hands are the devil's workshop." Speaking of Proverbs, chapter 11, verse 13, NIV, says, A gossip betrays a confidence, but a trustworthy person keeps a secret. And Proverbs 11:9, NIV, says, "With their mouths the godless destroy their neighbors, but through knowledge the righteous escape." Messages directing civilians not to disclose military information may seem unnecessary or not important, but even minute details pieced together might form something of use to the enemy and mean death to friendly forces. Another of the 7 deadly sins, lust, has been used to deter these behaviors. Depictions of very attractive women, likely women of ill repute, reminds us that careless talk costs lives. Another poster depicting lust is quite overt. Allure or a lure. For that same subject of guarding information, a new phrase is coined based on Proverbs 14:23. In all labor there is profit, but the talk of lips tendeth only to penury. This passage is the formation of the still common message, loose lips sink ships. Oh, and let's talk about proper women working. Such a new disturbing ideal, right? There are several posters that call women to the workplace, like nurses or factory workers. For example, one showed a doe-eyed nurse, probably on her knees. She's looking up at him with reverence in her eyes. She's deifying the man. Obviously, it's good old Uncle Sam. Ephesians 3:14, New King James, says, "They who kneel before God can stand before anyone." Stand before anyone, a woman? There are dozens of these messages. The war effort needed everything from everyone, according to James Kimball when describing the engendered home front. Will there be any jobs when soldiers get home? Will there be any home-cooked meals anymore? Hell in a handbasket, I tell ya. I recall one poster at least that showed a proper woman. She's at home, she's got a house, 2 kids, and probably a job. She gave her man already. The implied message is that she has sacrificed sufficiently, but won't you tithe to the government? Everyone has to sacrifice for the war effort. Malachi 3:10 says, "Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. Test me in this, says the Lord Almighty, and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessings that you will not have enough room for it." Blasphemy at its finest, I tell you. Oh, and speaking of sacrifice, the sacrifice knows no bounds. Heck, half our trash is required for the war effort. Pouring that bacon fat in the trash, are you? Awfully greedy, awfully gluttonous, are you? You better take it and turn it in. That's the stuff of munitions. There are several verses that point to the sin of gluttony with regards to overeating, but Proverbs 28:7 says, "A discerning son heeds instruction, but a companion of glutton disgraces his father." This example is a bit more poignant for these gluttonous actions, condemned by a number of posters regarding scrap collection and waste reduction that supports the war effort. J.R.R. Tolkien remarks, "The news today about atomic bombs is so horrifying one is stunned. The utter folly of these lunatic physicists to consent to do such work for war purposes, calmly plotting the destruction of the world. Such explosives in men's hands, while their moral and intellectual status is declining, is about as useful as giving out firearms to all inmates, then saying that you hope this will ensure peace. Well, we're in God's hands. But he does not look kindly on Babel builders." That's the signpost up ahead. Your next stop, the Trinity Zone.
We're here in New Mexico at the Trinity test site, which was named by Robert Oppenheimer. In July 1945, a nuclear bomb named the Gadget was exploded. While Oppenheimer states in a letter written later that he's unsure of why he named the site Trinity, he took inspiration from poet John Donne, who wrote many poems with spiritual overtones, including the line, "Batter my heart, thy three-person God." Additionally, he references another Donne work about belief in resurrection, allowing the dying to feel unafraid. Despite the best calculations and scientific methods available, the results of detonating the bomb were unknown and greatly feared. Those with a belief in the afterlife may have been slightly less concerned for the consequences. Coming from Jewish ancestry, Oppenheimer's dedication to literature and citation of John Donne illustrates how deeply Christian messaging appears throughout the war. An interesting fact about the Trinity test site: at the moment of the explosion, a new element was created. It is a radioactive glass-like material formed in the heat of the blast. They called it trinitite, and I've got a piece in my hand. The 3 nuclear bombs are the culmination of the top-secret Manhattan Project, one of the largest and best-kept secrets of the war. After the gadget was detonated, Oppenheimer quotes John Donne again on the sign behind me. "Now I am become death, destroyer of worlds." He understood the power of what they had created up the road here.
After Trinity, 2 additional weapons would be used in combat, with the second bomb in Nagasaki, Japan on August 9, 1945. VJ Day, or Victory in Japan Day, on August 15, 1945, ends the war. The Writers' War Board was silent on the Manhattan Project, but newspaper cartoonists were not. A number of cartoons appeared in period editions, often containing biblical references among the rubble of violent peace. The Chicago Tribune published a cartoon just after the second bomb dropped in combat. In it, Aladdin, in the salute of the U.S. soldier, quotes Shakespeare, but might just as easily be quoting Isaiah 6:8. Also, "I heard the voice of the Lord saying, 'Whom shall I send, and whom will go for us?' Then I said, 'Here am I, send me.'" Another cartoon published in the Chicago Tribune on August 12, 1945, showed the dove of peace and hope wielding the nuclear bomb. Noah sent out the dove, looking for the waters to have receded, and Genesis 8:11 says, "When the dove returned to him in the evening, there in its beak was a freshly plucked olive leaf, signifying new life after total destruction by the floods."
You've all seen The Wizard of Oz since its 1938 debut, right? Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. Dorothy's little dog Toto fools the wizard's illusion by revealing him as a frail old man behind smoke and mirrors. During World War II, the man behind the curtain was the U.S. government, and the rest of Oz is thinly veiled as the Writers' War Board, formed by the Office of War Information and the War Advertising Council. The Writers' War Board created the propaganda designed to keep the populace in line with the government's end goal. The U.S. government serves as Big Brother, or as close as possible without the inventiveness of George Orwell and the technology he imagined for 1984. World War II propaganda, issued by the United States government, was heavily impacted by the predominantly Christian religious influence which was omnipresent throughout U.S. culture and politics, and can be observed when 1940s newspeak, circulated to the general populace, is juxtaposed to the commonplace religious ideologies of the time. The government is a very smart entity that knows how to keep itself out of trouble, all the while accomplishing whatever goal it deems necessary.
In philosophy or religion or ethics or politics, 2 and 2 might make 5. But when one was designing a gun or an airplane, they had to make 4. George Orwell, 1984.
During World War II, that necessary goal was anything vital to win the war. The citizens of the country have to sacrifice in every way, not only in sending their men, their fathers, their sons, and their husbands to be soldiers, to fight, to die, also to convert the entire country into a war production enterprise. The government saw this and acted using propaganda and society's common Christian ideals.
Today, we'll see you off with some words from our friend the Scarecrow in The Wizard of Oz. No matter how dreary and gray our homes are, we people of flesh and blood would rather live there than any other country, be it ever so beautiful. There's no place like home.
Big Brother is watching you.